This video will show you how to complete the Corporate Identification Information Record in Fintracker. Completing this form is an important step in fulfilling your obligations under the PCML TFA. Under this act, you're required to verify the identities of any parties that you're representing in your transaction, whether they're the client, any parties who are contributing funds to your deal, or in the case of a FSBO, it could be a self-represented party. The Corporate Identification Information Record is your method of verifying the identity of your client when you're working with a corporation or an entity. So what is a corporation or an entity? By these terms, we mean any corporation, trust, fund, partnership, or any unincorporated association or organization. So you would complete a corporate identification information record when you're working with any business or any legal entity. And you should note that this doesn't just affect you when you're working with commercial deals. For example, if you're representing an individual client, but they're using their personal business to fund the deal, then you would need to complete a corporate identification information record for their business. You're required to complete a corporate identification information record before writing the offer if you're the cooperating agent, and before writing the listing if you're the seller's agent. You should also write the corporate identification information record before you complete a receipt of funds record. This ensures accuracy and consistency between your FinTrack paperwork and your offer paperwork, and make sure that there are no mistakes or discrepancies between your FinTrack paperwork and your agreement of purchase and sale. Now that we've discussed the purpose and the timing of the corporate identification information record, let's take a look at an example of how to complete it. Here's our sample corporate client that we'll be working with, North Star Properties. This is a federally incorporated Canadian company, so that means that they are a corporation, and their purpose is the acquisition, development, and management of residential and commercial real estate properties. They operate primarily in Ontario, and they have 3 owners. So in this scenario, they've contacted us about purchasing a commercial property for their business. Let's look at how we would complete a corporate identification information record for this client. From the My Records screen in Fintracker, click on the plus sign in the top right-hand corner of the screen. Then from the drop-down menu, select New Corporate Identification. This will open up the form. First, you'll see that your name and brokerage will auto-populate based on your settings in Fintracker. You'll need to indicate if you're completing this record for the buyer client or the seller client. Next, you'll have the option to add your record to a transaction kit. Now remember, you can ID a client before you have a transaction with them. The best practice is to ID your client early in the process, and it must be done before you write the offer. But good news, you just have to do this once, and then you can use Search Previous to retrieve the record and add it to a new transaction kit for each offer that you do. So at this stage, you could just leave this blank and then just save the record until you know the property that you're going to place the offer on. But in this example, we're going to pretend that we're about to write the offer and we know what property we're going to use. So start by clicking on the Transaction Property Address field. In the pop-up, enter the full address, including the street address, any units, the city, province, and postal code. And remember that this is the address of the property that you're putting in the offer for. Or if you're the listing agent, this is the address that you're listing. Make sure that you enter the address correctly, as this is the address that will auto-populate all of the records in your transaction kit. So our corporate client is interested in purchasing the property at 456 Main Street in Toronto, Ontario, M1J 4P5, and it's unit number 200. So I've entered that information, click Set. And then for the date, enter today's date. Now let's get into the verification stage. Section A is all about verifying the identity of your corporate client. And this is an important component of knowing your client under FinTrack. Now, for every corporate identification information record, you will complete either Section A1 or Section A2. A1 is for verifying the identity of a corporation. A2 is for verifying the identity of any other entity. So what's the difference between a corporation and an entity? A corporation is a legal entity separate and distinct from its owners with its own rights and responsibilities. Similar to individuals, corporations can enter into contracts, loan and borrow money, sue and be sued, own assets, and pay taxes. A distinguishing characteristic of a corporation is limited liability. This means that its shareholders profit through dividends and stock appreciation, but they are not personally liable for the company's debts. Almost all large businesses are corporations. Now, while an entity can be a corporation, it could also be a trust, partnership, fund, or an unincorporated association. Corporations are subject to different requirements. Also, a corporation will have articles of incorporation, whereas other entities will not. Articles of incorporation are legal documents on file with a provincial or federal government to establish a business as a corporation. This process transforms the business into a recognized legal entity separate from the owners, and this provides a formal structure to operate under. Now, the main takeaway for you is that whether it's a corporation or not will just determine how you complete the Fintrack record, and it will determine the type of documents that you use to verify the identity of your client. Generally, if it's a corporation, you will use articles of incorporation. So let's look at how you would complete this section if you're working with a corporation. In this scenario, you would complete section A1. As mentioned, to verify the identity of a corporation, you should use their articles or certificate of incorporation. So let's look at our sample article of incorporation for our company. Now, articles of incorporation, as we said, are legal documents filed with a provincial or federal government to officially establish a business as a corporation. And on the articles of incorporation, you would find information such as the official corporation name, their registered address, information about their directors and beneficial owners, the purpose of the company, shareholder information, etc. So it's very important to take the information directly from here and enter it exactly into the corporate identification information record. So to start, we'll enter the name of the corporation exactly as it appears on the article of incorporation. Next, we'll enter the registered office address, and again, exactly as it appears on the article of incorporation. And we'll make sure that the address, city, country, province, postal code, suite, or unit number, that everything matches exactly what is on the official document. In the next field, you'll enter the nature of the principal business. Now, generally in the articles of incorporation, you should see a clause or a section that relates to the activities of the corporation. So you can take that information from here. Next, enter the names of the directors. Make sure to list all of the directors' full legal names taken from the articles of incorporation and verified with their IDs. And note that you'll also need to complete an individual identification information record for each of the directors. To enter their name, just type the name and hit enter. In the next field, you need to list the type of verification record that you've used. So in this case, we've used the articles of incorporation. And then you'll have to list the source of your verification record. And note that you'll need to take a copy of your verification record and submit it along with your corporate ID form. Now, you could use a paper version, for example, a copy of the company's articles of incorporation, but you can also use an electronic version, for example, Corporation Canada's website. Now, Corporation Canada is a public database that keeps a record of all federally incorporated businesses in Canada. You can type in the name of the business, and it will give you information about the business, such as their corporate name, their status, the directors, beneficial owners, all of the information that you would need to fulfill your record. So here's a sample with the information redacted. Now, if you use a database like this as your source of information, then you just need to list it as the source on your corporate ID record, and you also need to take a copy. So to do so, you could just click here where it says View PDF Sample, and you'll get a PDF copy of the source that you can attach to your transaction along with your Fintrack paperwork. Now back to our record, you would list your source here. So you could write Corporation Canada database, and then you would write in the registration number, which can be found on the Corporation Canada record page. Now, if you're dealing with an entity other than a corporation, they will not have articles of incorporation. So the process would be essentially the same, but some of the information that you collect may differ. So let's look at A2 to see how you would complete it when dealing with an entity that is not a corporation. So for an entity other than a corporation, you could use a partnership agreement, articles of association, or the most recent version of any other record that confirms its existence and contains its name and address. For example, an annual report or a notice of assessment. Again, you would enter the name of the entity exactly as it appears on the official documentation, enter the entity's official address as it appears on their documentation, enter the nature of their principal business, and finally list the type of verification record that you used. For example, article of association or partnership agreement, etc. And just like we did before, you would write the source of the verification record. And remember, a copy has to be kept. And if it's an online database, you would need to write the name of the database and the registration number. Section A3, that would be for when you're working with a self-represented entity. For example, in the case of a FSBO or a mere posting, and you're unable to verify their ID. You should always ask and attempt to verify the information, but in these cases, sometimes the self-represented party may refuse to provide the information. In that case, then you would fill out this portion. Click the checkbox to indicate that you asked the self-represented party for information to confirm their existence. then select the date that you requested the information. Then you would list the reason why the measure was not successful. But you should note that you should not list a circumstantial restraint as a reason. For example, if you say the client was too busy to provide the information, that's not sufficient. You have to prove that you tried to verify their ID and the client absolutely refused. Now, again, this is only for those situations where you're dealing with a self-represented party who refuses to provide information. Most of the time, you're not going to be filling this out. Most of the time, you would just click this box, skip unrepresented entity reasonable measures record, because it's not relevant. So you would just skip it. For example, we have obtained the information for our client in section A1. Then we're going to check that box and skip it. And same with A2, we're going to skip A2 as well. In section B, you'll need to indicate if there is a third party involved in the transaction or not. If the answer is no, you can just click no and continue on. If there is a third party involved, then you should select yes and complete the third party record in section B2. If the third party is an individual, the best practice here is to scan the third party's ID wherever possible. But if the third party isn't comfortable with that, you can enter the information manually, making sure that each field matches their ID exactly.
You will also need to submit a copy of the source photo ID in your SkySlope checklist along with your Fintrack paperwork. Failure to do so will result in a rejected record. Now, this is only required if you manually input the information. If you choose to scan the client's photo ID, then you will not need to submit a copy of the ID.
Some important things to note. Do not assume that you know the third party's name. Copy it directly from their ID to ensure that you have their full legal name, because a lot of people may go by a different name than is listed on their ID. So you want to make sure you take it exactly from their ID. Enter their complete address exactly as it appears on their ID, as well as their phone number and their date of birth. In the occupation section, be very specific. This is a spot where we see a lot of errors. You need to avoid acronyms, and you need to make sure that what you're putting down makes sense. For example, if someone is unemployed, you need to find out where their source of funds is coming from. If someone is retired, you need to write retired and then their former occupation. So retired teacher, retired bank teller. Write the name of their employer or their former employer. It needs to make sense in regards to the transaction. And if it doesn't, you need to request more information from the client. Then you would list the relationship to the client. For example, is it a family member? Is it a friend? Etc. Now, if there's a third party who's a corporation, then you would enter the name of the entity or corporation in the name field. Make sure it matches their articles of incorporation or their articles of association. Then enter the registered office address and phone number in the address fields. List their registration number that can be found on their articles of incorporation or in the database, and their issuing jurisdiction. For example, is it Ontario, Canada, etc. Don't use acronyms. Write out the full name of the province or the country. And finally, the relationship to the client. For example, maybe the client also owns this corporation, or maybe this corporation is owned by the friend of a client. You would explain that in this field here. But in our case, we do not have a third party, so we're going to click no. Now, moving on to section C. Here you'll answer some questions to obtain a risk score for your client. And this will give you an indication of whether or not this is a safe client to proceed with, or if additional measures are required. They're pretty self-explanatory, but let's briefly go through them. Prior to this transaction, did you previously work with this client or have a relationship with them? No, this is our first time. To your knowledge, do they have a criminal history? No. Is there a concern about money laundering or terrorist financing in the location of the property or where the client is operating? No, not in this case. Is the client situated within 10 kilometers of an international border or 5 kilometers of an international airport? No. Is the client a Canadian corporation or entity? Yes. Is the client subject to a ministerial directive? So a ministerial directive is a legally binding instruction from the Minister of Finance that tells us that we have to automatically take enhanced measures for financial transactions with the affected country. There are presently 3 ministerial directives. They are for North Korea, Russia, and Iran. This means that if the client is a citizen of one of those countries under a directive, or if the funds are coming from one of these countries, then we need to take enhanced measures. So in this case, no, our client is not subject to a ministerial directive. Are you aware of any other connection to a high-risk country? So for example, Myanmar is a country that doesn't have a ministerial directive, but it is still listed as a high-risk country. Our client doesn't have any connection, so we'll click no. Has the client attempted to conceal its identity in any way? No. Has your brokerage previously filed a suspicious transaction or terrorist property report on this client? No. Does the transaction seem unusual in light of the client's business? No. Now, obviously, we're answering no, but if any of your answers were yes, you would just click yes. Does the transaction involve a third party? So no, we've determined it does not. Did you verify the existence of your client in a non-face-to-face setting? No, we verified in person. Did the client provide some or all of the deposit in cash? No. Does the transaction seem unusual in light of the client's past transactions with the brokerage? No. Does the client appear to be a shell company? So a shell company is an inactive company used as a vehicle for various financial maneuvers. For example, it could be used as a legitimate face for illegal operations as a means of laundering dirty money. So no, in this case, it is not. Does the client operate a cash-intensive business, for example, a bar or a laundromat, or offer online gambling? So cash-intensive businesses such as bars, clubs, laundromats, casinos, etc., these are often used as vehicles to launder money. And because of the high level of cash that is changing hands with these types of businesses, it can be difficult to trace the source of funds. And that's why we have to be on alert when working with these types of businesses. So in this case, no, it is not that type of business. Is there anything else unusual about the client or the transaction? No. So once you've responded to all the questions, then click the Save and Calculate button. The system will then provide a risk score for your client. Now, if you score anything above 10, or if you have any reservations, please escalate to the compliance team immediately. In this case, you can see we have a low risk score, so we're good to proceed with the transaction. Now, in Section D, you will record information about your business relationship with the client. D1 is very simple. You just need to select the checkbox that describes your business relationship with the client. For example, is your client purchasing land for commercial use or commercial property itself? Select the box appropriate to your situation. In this case, our client's going to purchase commercial property. The next box is optional, where you can go into further detail about your business dealings. For example, if the client regularly purchases property for investment purposes, you could write that here, but this isn't a mandatory field, so we're going to leave that blank. Now, D2 asks what you will do to maintain your business relationship with the client and keep their information up to date. Now, in this section, we often see mistakes because agents are listing what their relationship is instead of listing what they will do in order to maintain the relationship. For example, sometimes we see things where the agent selects other and then they write, this is my sister's company or this is my company. But this does not directly answer the question of how you will maintain the relationship with this entity. No matter whose company it is, you need to indicate the specific steps that you're going to take to keep the company info up to date. So for example, ask the client to provide identification each time they do a real estate transaction with the brokerage. And all you have to do is check that box. So please pay attention here in this section, as this is a common reason for rejected paperwork. You need to complete section D.2.3 if your client is a high-risk client. So this could be based on the score you obtained in section C, for example. You would complete this with your compliance officer because you need to escalate any high-risk clients to the compliance team. So they would guide you on how to fill out this section. In general, you won't need to complete this for most clients. D3 provides an important reminder that if you see something suspicious, you must report it to the compliance team. Remember, use what you've learned in your other anti-money laundering training modules about red flags and suspicious transactions, and always use your best judgment. Section E is a reminder to follow the brokerage procedures for terrorist property reports. So Zolo is required to report terrorist property reports to the RCMP, CSIS, and Fintracker. More information can be found in Zolo's Anti-Money Laundering and Anti-Terrorist Financing Policy and Procedures Manual. Now, finally, the last section will ask you about beneficial ownership. And this section can be tricky to fill out because sometimes it's hard to find the information for this section. A beneficial owner is someone who owns 25% or more of an entity. It's important to trace beneficial ownership information as it could help to identify cases of money laundering, and specifically layering, which is a technique where money launderers build layers of transactions in order to conceal the source of dirty money. So if the entity is a corporation, first you'll be asked if anyone owns 25% or more shares in the corporation. Now note that this can be direct ownership or indirect. For example, if someone owns shares in a corporation that in turn owns shares in this corporation, and those shares add up to more than 25% ownership, this would be indirect beneficial ownership. It's important to follow the trail to determine ownership. Now, to help you collect this information, Zolo provides the shareholder registry. This is a mandatory form that you have to complete for every corporate identification information record. You can find the form by looking on the Zolo FAQ. And you just need to have your client complete the form by listing any shareholders, the number of shares that they own, and their percentage ownership. The form is then signed by an authorized party at the corporation. Like I said, this is mandatory for all corporate deals, and it facilitates the information collection process for you. Make sure that all the beneficial ownership information on the shareholder registry matches what you put into Fintracker exactly. Now, if there's no one who owns 25% or more, then you would just click no. But if there are owners who control 25% or more, you would click yes, and then you would enter their names. And it needs to match the shareholder registry exactly. And also their addresses, full addresses, with the city, country, province, and postal code. And you can add multiple people here. And obviously, if you're working with a trust instead of a corporation, and do the same exercise, you would fill out their name, address, all of their information. Same with a widely held public trust or other. Now, in our example, we are working with a corporation. There are individuals who own 25% or more of the corporation, and I've listed them here. There are 3 directors who happen to be beneficial owners, and I've listed all their information here. And I've also completed my shareholder registry. I've listed the 3 owners, and the information here matches the corporate ID record exactly. And of course, it will be signed by the authorized person at the company. Once you've entered all of that information, then we'll move on to section 2, which is about ownership, structure, and control. And here I've just listed that there are 3 directors who are beneficial owners, and I've listed their names and the percentage of ownership that they control. Next, we'll have to answer if it's a not-for-profit organization or not. So in this case, no, it's not a not-for-profit. If it was a nonprofit organization, you would click yes. And then you need to answer if it's a registered charity or not, yes or no. And if you click no, you would need to enter whether or not they solicit charitable donations from the public or not. But in this case, we're not working with a nonprofit organization, so we'll click no. And then in section 4, you need to confirm the accuracy of the information in sections 1, 2, and 3. So you just need to tick the boxes to document the measures that you took to confirm that the information you've entered up here is accurate. So in this case, we asked the entity directly for the information, and they provided their articles of incorporation, and they filled out the shareholder registry. And as a best practice, we also did an internet search. And yes, the entity provided a signed letter confirming the veracity of the information. So they did because they provided the shareholder registry and they signed it. Now here you would indicate which piece of information they provided. So in this case, we worked with their articles of incorporation. And then we just need to input the date that the above measures were taken. Now in section 5, you would complete this section only if you could not obtain the information in sections 1 and 2. That means that you were not able to obtain information about beneficial ownership. And generally, you need to always collect this information. So it's very rare you would ever fill out number 5. But if you really were unable to obtain the information, then you would just tick the applicable boxes. But this doesn't apply in our case. And you'll see that if this section is necessary, that you need to speak with your compliance officer. And then once you've entered all your information, you can click save. And then you will be ready to move on to the next step, which would be completing your receipt of funds record.